The Academy of France hadn't shaken that off 2,200 some years later. They object to simple universal causes and reject entirely theoretical medicine, for, quote, even philosophers would have become the greatest of medical practitioners if reasoning from theory could have made them so. So the empiricists don't think that you can take several concretes and get away from those into an abstract that's true and related to the concretes. In essence, they do not believe in abstraction. They do not believe in epistemology. Now, we move all the way to the 2nd century after Christ for remarks on Greek medicine and its relation to the history of science. The most important single figure in Greek medicine after Hippocrates is Galen. Galen was not really a member of any medical sect, but he was probably closer in spirit to the dogmatists than to the empiricists. Because the dogmatists accepted evidence from both. So what the hell is a dogmatist? This, of course, did not prevent him from being one of the greatest medical experimenters in the history of early medicine. We can illustrate this fact by quoting from his demonstration of the irreversibility of the flow of urine from the kidney and the bladder. Now, dear audience members, I spare you. He quotes at length from Galen on the Natural Faculties, Book 1, Chapter 13, Loeb Classical Library Translations of A. J. Brock, London, 1916. So have at it if you will. Then we take a paragraph after that long length of quote, and then we skip a bunch more, because this is crazy. Galen was enormously prolific as a writer, and his works deal with a number of philosophical questions not connected with medicine. He may have dissected human cadavers, but even if so, he dissected animals much more frequently, including Barbary apes and pigs. Many of his mistakes in anatomy and physiology derive from the fact that the analogies were too close that he attempted to draw between man and the animals he dissected. So in the absence of good evidence, he just overgeneralized from the animals he was able to look at. Now at this point we continue on page 62, quote, Galen was of special importance for medieval science, for it is his presentation of Greek medicine. Galen was of special importance for medieval science, for it is his presentation of Greek medicine that, with Hippocratic corpus, was to be translated and studied in both Islam and the West, and it was his emphasis on the teleological or purposeful function of all the parts and organs of the body that was to appeal so greatly to both Islamic and Christian physicians. Now we start a fantastic section on Aristotle. The beginnings of the study of human biology we have seen appear in the medical works of antiquity. Those parts of biology which are designated as natural history, particularly zoology and botany, emerge as separate sciences in the 4th century BC. That would be in the 300s. Chiefly responsible was Aristotle, born 384, died 322, son of a physician, the great philosopher of Stagira, a town in northeastern Chalcis. Son of a physician, the great philosopher of Stagira, a town in northeastern Chalcis, came to Athens to study with Plato at the age of 17, and stayed with Plato until the latter's death in 347 BC. The impression made upon Aristotle by Plato was profound, and the dialogues written by Aristotle in this period, and now lost, were Platonic in spirit and content, according to our scanty knowledge of them. Leaving Athens, Aristotle studied and probably taught successively at Assos, and Lesbos in Asia Minor, then proceeded to the court of Philip of Macedonia to act as a tutor to the young Alexander, the future conqueror of Greece and the whole Near East. Alexander did not arise in Greece, he conquered Greece. He was a Macedonian, as was Aristotle. This period of wandering terminated with Aristotle's return to Athens in 335 BC. On his return, he founded the famous Lyceum, which became the first great scientific research center in the history of mankind, with the possible exception of Plato's Academy. But Plato's Academy appears to have been a place of philosophical inquiry, which included, of course, mathematics. Wouldn't that be what Plato's Academy would be? Very abstract, non-concrete, non-scientific, right? Which objectivists know means non-reality oriented. So it was a school of philosophical inquiry more than it was a school for the patient collecting and organizing of scientific data, as the Lyceum clearly became. Now there's a gentleman named Jaeger, J-A-E-G-E-R, one of the greatest students of Aristotle, quote, has advanced the persuasive idea that in the course of Aristotle's career, his approach developed from one that was predominantly Platonic and metaphysical to one that was increasingly empirical and more interested in what the Greeks call historia, i.e. research. Thus, Jaeger believes that it was during the Lyceum period that Aristotle pursued further the research into and organization of zoological data, which he probably had begun with Theophrastus, his associate and successor, on the island of Lesbos in his middle period. I pause for just a second to say Theophrastus is perhaps Aristotle's greatest successor, and we'll hear a little bit more about him, but he was in biology, very much so, just a biological scientist, inquirer. So Aristotle's great legacy in philosophy went uninherited. Presumably Aristotle's great parts of animals and history of animals took final form at the Lyceum. The botanical works of Theophrastus were probably begun during the middle and last periods of Aristotle's life. To the period of the Lyceum belong, in all probability, Aristotle's short biological tracts called the Parva Naturalia, also his meteorology, and a lost work on the flooding of the Nile, of which we have just one brilliant fragment that disposes of the problem much mooted by Greek natural philosophers. Quote from Aristotle's work on the flooding of the Nile. This is the only thing we have. The Nile floods are no longer a problem, for it has been actually observed that rains are the cause of the swelling. End quote. Patient work in chronological studies was also undertaken at the Lyceum, such as collecting the names of the winners of the Pythian Games and assemblage of the records of dramatic performance at Athens. Historia at the Lyceum is no doubt illustrated also by the collection of 158 constitutions of the various city-states, of which the extant Constitution of Athens forms one book. It was also at the Lyceum that first researches into the history of science were conducted, Theophrastus undertaking the history, partly extant, of the opinions of the physici, or natural philosophers, Menon, describing the history of medicine, only extracts extant, and a third student, Eudemus, dealing with the history of arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, only extracts extant. The schematism, or systemization, undertaken at the Lyceum was of great importance, but, according to Jaeger, quote, to suppose its real achievement lay in the classification of animals and plants would be wrong. It was far less important in the development of natural science than the fact that here, for the first time, the observations and description of the individual and its life history was being taken absolutely seriously. Now we skip just a bit. His more philosophical work on the soul is also important for understanding his views on life. We are not to think that, because he paid more attention to detailed research toward the end of his career, Aristotle abandoned some of the important philosophical principles that had no doubt developed by the time of this middle period. In a sense, the earlier periods gave him a certain fundamental metaphysical framework from which he amended as the result of his research, but did not necessarily abandon. His ideas of matter and form, of the various kinds of causation, of movement, the actualizing of a potentiality, all play an important role in